Hello and welcome to this review of The Island of Sea Women by Lisa C. This is what would we call it? It's calling itself historical, and it is. Fiction, I'm pretty sure the main characters are. Historical New York bestseller Times list-ish. So New York Times bestseller author Lisa C has now written a book about the Island of Sea Women. I gather she was a bestseller for something else. I don't know if this one's a bestseller. Great cover that really tells you what it's all about. This book was a gift for me from another woman of my acquaintance who also loves the ocean. It's a pretty chunky book and it was a bit of a slow read, really. It took me a couple of days. Great read on the beach, I've got to say. And I guess the book itself can best describe to an extent what it's about, which is the island of Jeju from Korea. Now, I'm probably mispronouncing everything. I don't speak Korean. I've actually never had a huge amount of knowledge about or interest in Korea as a country. No disrespect to Korea and Koreans. It's just there's a lot of countries out there and you tend to focus on one or the other, especially if you've been there. I've never been to Korea. But now I really want to go to the island of Jeju. I had to Google where it was. It's kind of in the middle of the sea, just south off the edge of Korea. And when this book kind of opens is in the 30s when it's colonized by the Japanese. As an Australian who's read a fair bit of World War II literature and who knows a few veterans, I'm used to hearing horrible stories about what happened under the Japanese in World War II and in prisoner camps. I had no idea what I was in for. It's much worse here. It's dramatic. And not knowing a lot of information about Korean history, I didn't really know much about the fact that after World War II and the events in Japan, America ended up taking over Korea. I knew that, and I knew how the split between North and South and communism, etc., happened. During that, Jeju was occupied by the Americans, and things got worse than they were under the Japanese, with massacres of potentially hundreds of thousands of people, huge areas decimated, whole villages burnt to the ground. It's a bit of a harrowing tale, and I wasn't expecting it. What I was expecting is the story of the villages, all-female diving collectives that were common and indeed the mainstay of the coasts of Jeju in the 30s and 40s, I guess. So this follows from the 30s through to the 2008, I think is the last one. And so you learn about how the village used to be under Japan, under America, all the things that happened to the island of Jeju as they were happening through Korea. And you follow all this through two main characters. The characters in question are Young Suk, our primary narrator, and her best friend Mi Ja. And again, I'm probably mispronouncing them, but what can you do? Now, I was utterly fascinated by the history, so the world building, the stories about the sea women and their diving, and I loved every aspect of that. I don't read a lot of mainstream fiction these days anymore, and this did read very much like mainstream fiction in a few ways. I enjoyed it. I'd give it a 3 out of 5, maybe a 3.5 out of 5 stars. And it's not a world changer for me, but if I were in a different stage of my life, it might have been a world changer. And it's well worth written. As with all best-selling authors, you can expect excellent writing, spectacular research. The research is phenomenal. And good editing. And you have certain expectations about mainstream literature, novel structure. They're all there. There's also a wonderful, wonderful level of detail earlier on rather than later on for me. Now, okay, so things I liked and things I didn't like. Overall, I thought this was a great book, and I would recommend it to many people who are interested in the sea, interesting collectives. It's not a matriarchal culture that's being described here. It's called matrifocal, so centered on women but not run by women, because you've still got a balance of male-female society. In honesty, if you watch this channel often, you'll know I read a lot of science fiction and fantasy. And in honesty, the culture that's described here for Jeju on the island, in the real world, is in many ways more alien and more science fiction than dozens of books that I've read representing science fiction-y or alien cultures. The whole collective and the way it's organized, the way the women go down to the sea and wrap themselves in cotton and dive in these cold, cold temperatures while the fathers stay home taking care of the children and the house, theoretically. The whole way that's described is excellent. And I love the historical descriptions. I think this book probably will inspire me to go on and read some of the books that Lisa See sourced her information from. They're all in the back. In actual fact, my favorite part in a way was the acknowledgements, where she gives a huge amount of information about this culture, where she got her information from, other books that I could read in the future, and the fascinating daily activities of living in an incredibly poor village, as it was in the 30s when this book kind of begins. There is also an interesting point that is made afterwards. Throughout this book, she calls them Heienyo, which I'm also mispronouncing because my Japanese is pretty bad. Heienyo is a Japanese word, not a Korean word, and certainly not a Jeju word. I believe Jeju's language is distinct from Korean. The women divers of Jeju actually call themselves Jamsu, Jamenyo, or Jomenyo, something like that, which I'm also pronouncing incorrectly to be sure. But it seems to me odd that Lisa See would choose to call them Heienyo all the way through this book, because that's how the world sees them. Personally, I'd never heard of Heienyo. I'd heard of multiple types of women divers. There's lots of them in Japan, in the southern islands. They, I think, don't call themselves Heienyo either. So the choice of that particular word is just really weird to me throughout. However, history and background-wise, I think there's enough to satisfy anyone, however much or little they are interested in general in history or this sort of culture. I think there's enough for people who just want to read it as a literature novel about people, and there's enough to tempt people like me who will likely get more into the history and the actual culture. There are a lot of things throughout the book that I didn't love and meant that I actually read it quite slowly. I didn't love how grim it was. Now, sure, we start off kinda in the 30s when they're incredibly, incredibly poor. The only food they have is what they raise themselves by hand in small family plots. They make soup out of millet. They have sweet potatoes, and they have whatever they gather from the ocean. And that's pretty much it. But it's grim. And I don't think that any culture is really as grim as that early culture is portrayed. In fact, research, I'm sure, they're very poor by our standards, but by their standards, that was their life. And research in sociology and criminology has very clearly shown that poverty is not an index for unhappiness at all. In fact, or discontent. What is an index for unhappiness in discontent is incredible poverty next to incredible wealth. And in the early parts of this novel in the 30s, there was no actual wealth. Which leads me to the other thing that I really didn't love, the timey-wimey stuff. This novel doesn't actually start back in the 30s. It gives you a taster chapter set in 2008, an old woman sitting on a beach. And then we go back to 30 something or other when the old woman, that's Young Suk, is a 12-year-old who's going for her first experience in the diving collective. I get that timey-wimey is very, very popular in modern literature, especially. It's almost inescapable. Any book with the deep personal connection that they strive to create, is going to have timey-wimey. What happened in the past, what happens in the now, what happens in the future, the deep, deep emotions because of what happened in the past, whatever. I don't always hate it, but I almost never love it. So the fact that we already know how it ends in 2008 with Young Suk as an old woman meeting the great granddaughter of her old friend from when they were 12 years old, that tells us that they've clearly been estranged. It's like, essentially, you're giving me the end first. And I didn't love that. I can see why she did it. I'm sure most people will be fine with it. I know a lot of people love that back and forth methodology of building a sense of history and pathos and connection. I don't. Really don't. So I didn't love that, but that's a me thing. I did love the way, once we finally got away from 2008 with its earbuds and shorty shorts, the way that the author built up the relationship between young Suk and Mi Ja. So they'd actually met some 5 years before the 30s part of the novel, Timey-wimey again. It talks about how, as best friends, they go to the diving collective to become baby divers, the divers that have been taught the background and just starting to dive with the collective. The collective at that point is run by Young Suk's mother, who is this amazing, strong woman who controls her household and her children, but also all the women who dive in her collective, and it's only women that dive. I love the way the historical reason why this culture developed is presented by the author, because it's unusual for the women to become divers in that way. And she talks about the history of taxation that Korea exacted on men divers and men fishers that led to the women doing that part, because the household would end up with more earnings. So from there on, we progress by increments. We learn more about these Jomyo, women divers. We learn how they get sent away at a certain age to dive in other places like Vladivostok and the Yellow Sea. So we learn also about their actual diving practices, the different instruments that they use, which I again can't pronounce. They've got the thing floating on the top, which is where they put their catch into. They've got very minimal spear and crowbar sort of things that they take down into the ocean. It talks about their breathing and so forth. In the acknowledgements, Lisa C talks about how she got all that information. And I think she did a great job with it. I could have done with more. I was here for the ocean part of it. And while Lisa C did her best to make us feel how important the ocean was to the women who were diving in it, both as a source of nutrition and money, but also a part of their life, their day-to-day experience, the thing that they loved. It talks about older women who still go diving because nothing cures their aches and pains like going underwater. It doesn't stint on the dangers, the ringing ears at an early age from pressure damage, which I also have, and all the other things, but that early diving culture was fascinating. What Lisa C couldn't do was she couldn't convince me about how amazing the underwater is. And I was expecting her to. These women for whom the underwater is their life, I wanted to see more of it. So now I know that they hunted octopus, no big surprise, that abalone with a big, big skill. I've learned how they went about freeing it. But at no point did I get the feeling that the author or the narrator go under the water and suddenly they're at home. Nearly every scuba diver that I know, at some stage or other, remembers one of those world-building moments for them where they go under the ocean and no matter how scared they've been, no matter how tired they've been, they look around and there's this big, we're home. This is somewhere where I belong. Obviously, the Jumio would not have gone underwater, because the next step is breathing in, and that's not something you want to do in water. But I did expect to see that connection to the ocean, that way in which a collective would know their ocean basement like we know our backyard. I didn't quite get that. I don't think most people will miss that. I think scuba divers reading this book may. Now, any good mainstream literature fiction book knows that you have to have characters for the reader to connect with in order to make the book sing. In this case, they are Young Suk and her family, and Mi-ja and her experiences. We follow the young girls from 12 until they marry in their, I guess, late teens. And then they are sort of reft apart by their different husbands and their different experiences. And eventually they end up, both of them, in one of the major massacres that happened in Korea after the Japanese had left. This happened in the village of, or the location of, something beginning with B, which I really can't pronounce either. Bukho? Book? I don't know. I really probably should have looked up the whole pronunciation thing first, but would I have succeeded? It's not Korean pronunciation anyway. Anyhow, there was this huge massacre. Anything from 60,000 people to potentially as many as 300,000 people were slaughtered there. And this created the final rift between our two main characters, who went off to have their same lives, different lives, but they'd still see each other when Mi-jun came back to the village with her son, blah, 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 blah. I didn't love that part, and it was too much. I could have done with more ocean and more culture, more sociology even. Less of the two of them, and it's all from one point of view, which isn't a bad thing. But it means you're seeing it all from Young Suk's point of view, and it's pretty damning in many regards. Her friend wasn't a good friend and probably not a good person. She herself said she wasn't a good person. But that means that I really didn't like the ending. So the ending, which is actually the beginning in 2008, Young Suk is an old woman picking seaweed along the beach, and along comes this mixed family with American accents, but clearly some Jeju blood in them, and they try to engage her in conversation about Mi-ja. And they've got a photograph of the two of them together. She doesn't want anything to do with them, but they keep coming back like a bad smell. And eventually she agrees to talk to the great-granddaughter, Clara, and we learn about, I guess, why they've come back to harass poor old Young Suk about it. And I get that we're meant to have all the feels and the emotions that are involved. I get that we're meant to, but I just saw it as a cheap trick in a weary old trope. It's like the person Mi-ja was never told her friend anything. But now Clara's got it all recorded on her iWave or whatever. And now, all of a sudden, Young Suk is meant to be, oh, my friend was my friend after all, I was so wrong all these years. No. I don't agree. I don't agree. And I didn't like the way the book really seemed to be preaching at me moralistically about how Young Suk should have behaved. Now, I don't believe that Mi-ja and Young Suk are actually real people. I don't believe that you could get away with writing a book like this about two real people. But I do think that a lot of the events that were used to create those people were real events. But at the end of the day, the author is telling me how I should feel about their morals and how they should have behaved. How Young Suk should have accepted her friend, should have asked her more questions. But in actual fact, I disagree. No matter what the author of this thing thinks, I go Young Suk. She was a bad person. Hold on to your anger. Remain estranged. Sometimes dumping people who are bad for you is the best thing you could do for yourself, and sometimes leaving places that are bad to you are the best things you can do. So, didn't love the moralistic thing at all. You can have your opinions and you're welcome to them, but don't bludgeon me into thinking that I need to share them. Other than those small whinges, and I always do whinge about books, so we're used to that. The Island of Sea Women is fascinating, and I actually am quite motivated to seek out a couple of the books which Lisa C. used to inform her writing. Thank you for watching. Read good books. If anything about bestseller, historical, fiction-y, non-fiction-y ones appeals to you, I thoroughly recommend this one. It is actually a good book. Not my favourite book for 2025 by any means, but definitely well worth reading. Thank you, Sally, should you ever happen to see this, for giving it to me for Christmas. When I was first reading it, around about the time I was being preached to, and I was thinking, this is getting a bit tedious, I was thinking I probably wouldn't keep this. I am going to loan it to a couple of people, but I am going to get it back, and I'm going to use that excellent acknowledgement at the back to learn more about this whole culture, this island, and maybe even visit it one day. I'd kind of like to visit it. Maybe even dive it if it isn't too cold. Thanks for watching. Read good books.